Hi, Chuck-Piro with Disclosure Source. Well, there sure has been a lot of confusion about the new home hardening law that took effect in January. So I thought we'd take a couple minutes here to explain a little bit about what home hardening is and maybe give you a little better understanding of it. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get this little presentation started. And here we go. So the new law, home hardening, took effect January 1st of 2021, and it requires sellers to provide a disclosure regarding home features that may make the home more susceptible to fire. This disclosure is triggered by the following. It's located within a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. The home was built before 2010, and it's residential 1 to 4, just very similar to the TDS. The home hardening disclosure and advisory form is just a one-page document that will require a seller to answer a series of questions specifying which home hardening features the home has that make the home vulnerable to wildfires and flying embers. This form is based on a seller's actual knowledge. So let's just go back and just answer this question. What is home hardening? Hardening your home against wildfires just means to take steps to improve the chance of your home and structures withstanding ignition by wildfires, firebrands, and flying embers. So put together this little Q&A that might help clarify some questions you might have. So the first question is the seller being asked to list all of the home hardening features the property has? And the answer is no, it's really quite the opposite. The seller is not being asked to disclose home hardening features, but instead is being asked to identify which features the property has which might make it vulnerable to wildfires and flying embers. The seller is required just to read through a limited list of such problematic conditions and check all that apply. So what are the questions being asked? Seller is aware of the following features that may make the home vulnerable to wildfire and flying embers. The seller is just asked to check all that apply. So let's just read through this list. Eaves, soffits, and roof ventilation where the vents have openings in excess of 1/8 of an inch or are not flame or ember resistant. Well, if I put myself in the position of a seller, I have no idea if I have openings in excess of 1/8 of an inch in my soffits or my eaves. That's just an area that I don't typically look at in my home. So if it were me, I wouldn't check it because I don't know. The next one, roof coverings made of untreated wood shingles or shakes. I would think that average people would know that. Combustible landscaping or other materials within 5 feet of the home and under the footprint of an attached deck. I would think all you need to do is take a little walk around your house. You'd be able to answer that question. Single pane or non-tempered glass windows, loose or missing bird stoppings or roof flashings and rain gutters, etc. These are just the questions being asked. Now, what if the seller doesn't know the answers to these questions? The seller is only required to make disclosures using the HHDA based upon their actual knowledge. The HHDA asks if the seller is aware. If the seller doesn't know, they can leave the box unchecked. It's that simple. So would the seller be required to investigate the property to figure out the correct answers? No. Again, this is based on what the seller knows. They don't have to hire an inspector to figure this out. They check the box on what they know. Here's an interesting question. If the disclosure is not required directly under the home hardening law, could it still be considered a material disclosure and thus a required disclosure nonetheless? Yes. We're going to talk about this more in a minute. If the property is located in or near mountainous area, forest-covered lands, brush-covered lands, grass-covered lands, or land that is covered with flammable material, a seller may choose to provide the home hardening disclosure nonetheless on the basis that it could be considered a material fact. This would also be recommended if the seller was unable to determine if the property was in one or more of the fire zones. In any event, a seller may always choose to deliver the disclosure voluntarily, whether or not it's mandated by law. That's a really important statement. Now, what I find curious about this statement is the word near. If the property is located in or near a mountainous area, well, I mean, how do you define near? I don't know that that can really be defined. So let's move on. What is the role of an NHD company? And I want to be real clear on this because I don't want people to think that we're not providing something we're supposed to provide, because we do have a role in this. The role of an NHD company is simply to disclose if the property is located within various fire zones, including high and very high fire severity zones, and to include a statutory notice in the NHD report when the property is in either a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. And this is the statutory notice. This is a CAR statutory notice that simply says this home is in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone, and this home was built before the implementation of the wildfire urban interface building codes, which help to fire harden a home. To better protect your home from wildfires, you might consider the following improvements, and they provide a website so that you can go find out what these improvements might be. Now, here is the CAR form, the home hardening form, HHDA. And let's take a look at one part of this form, and that's paragraph number 4. And let's just read this. It says, even if the property is not in either of the zones, that would be high or very high, or if the seller is unable to determine whether the property is in either of these zones, if the property is in or near a mountainous area, forest-covered lands, brush-covered lands, grass-covered lands, or land that is covered with flammable material, a seller may choose to make the disclosures below because a buyer might consider the information material. It goes on to say a seller may voluntarily make the disclosures even if not mandated by law. Now, I want to show you a fire map because when you only include the notice when the property is in a high or very high fire zone, according to state maps, you'd be ignoring all of the other fire zones that may affect the subject property. Excuse me. Let's take a look at this map. This is a fire map, and the colors give you varying degrees of the fire zone, high, very high, moderate, or perhaps even a fire zone that doesn't have an adjective in front of it. You're just in a fire zone. But when you look at this map, let's take a look at this little part of the map right here. Let's blow it up. And what about this parcel of land? Not in a fire zone, but surrounded by properties that are in a fire zone. What should that seller do with that property? Should he provide the notice to a potential buyer? I think the answer is pretty obvious. If a flying ember can fly a mile away to start a fire, then that would certainly apply in this situation. So let's take a look at a typical disclosure source NHD report, where we gather information from not only state and federal maps, but also from state maps. And here's a property that, according to state and federal maps, is not located in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. However, the same report, the same property, when we look at locally identified hazard zones, the property actually is located in a locally identified fire zone. So might the buyer find this information material? I think the answer is obvious, yes. And might the seller wish to provide home hardening information when they're selling this property? I think the answer is obvious, yes. Again, from the HHDA, it says a buyer might consider the information material. A seller may voluntarily make the disclosures, even if not mandated by law. So Disclosure Source has made a decision, and that is that we will include the notice in all of our reports, no matter what the determination is. And why are we doing this? Because doing so serves the best interest of both the seller and the seller's agent. Now, what's the agent's responsibility in this whole situation here? The conversation and advice about home hardening is one that takes place between you, the agent, and your seller. It's not one that takes place between the NHD company and the seller. This is a conversation that you need to have with your client. But I would just remind you of a statement from an old realtor who once said, "We never get sued for disclosing too much information. It's always the other way around." So keep that in mind. And one other thing before we close this out, and that is fine print disclaimers. That's probably the most important part of an NHG report is going to be the fine print disclaimers. And when you see a statement like this in your NHG report, quote, "The recipients in each of them expressly waive the benefits of California Civil Code 2778, close quote." Do you know exactly what benefit you're waiving? You're actually giving up the benefit of a paid defense by the NHD provider. Who would normally give up the benefit of a defense? So read the fine print. Education is what you get when you read the fine print. Experience is what you get when you don't. And then just a little bit about disclosure source. Like most providers in this unregulated NHD industry, disclosure source is not the typical unqualified entrepreneur who purchases data from data providers and then excludes liability protection with fine print disclaimers. Disclosure Source is actually a wholly owned subsidiary of Fidelity National Financial, which is a Fortune 500 company. And we're in the company of dozens of companies owned by F&F. This is a company with a solid financial background who does business in every state in the United States. We're not a little locally owned small company that might go out of business at any given time. So that ends our presentation today. But if you have any other questions, you can certainly get a hold of your rep, and they'd be happy to answer any of the questions that you might have. We appreciate you listening, and I hope this clears up some of the confusion. Thank you very much.